From Peacock, IGN, and Realm, this is Rise or Die, the official companion podcast to the Peacock original series, Those About to Die. I'm your host, Dana Schwartz, and on this podcast, I'll be talking to the cast and crew about bringing their stunning and brutal version of ancient Rome to life. The roar of the crowd. The sound that countless gladiators heard as they walked out onto the sands of the Roman arena. A sound that you can still hear today in stadiums around the world where athletes compete for wealth and glory. For this last episode of Rise or Die, I wanted to learn about how the creative team behind Those About to Die explored the similarities between the spectacle of the Roman arena and modern sports. To start, we return again to historical consultant Justin Pollard to talk about the bread and circuses and his feeling that F1 racing is the modern incarnation of the Circus Maximus. It feels like this show wears its influence from modern sports on its sleeve, and I feel like I learned so much about how much ancient Roman sports resembled sports today.
You look at modern sports arenas and they look like the Colosseum, Circus Maixmus, the Hippodrome. The basic structures come from there. At the time, this is the era famously of what Juvenal called bread and circuses, where the emperors and the aristocrats in Rome kept the large number of ordinary people under control by providing them with free wheat, free food, and free entertainment, games, gladiatorial combat, chariot racing. And the chariot racing was incredibly lavish, and it was the superstar event of its day. There were 4 factions who raced, red, white, blue, and green. And almost anyone in Rome would be a supporter of one of those. Like you support your football team or your baseball team. Absolutely passionate.
You pick your team, you wear the colors.
That's it. And you literally wear the colours. The people who rode for these teams were superstars. They were not rich people. They were not fancy people. They were at the bottom of society. Some had been slaves and had bought their freedom. Their job was considered sort of unmentionable by rich and aristocratic people, but what they could do was get money. People literally threw money at them. They became superstars on the street. The better they did, the more they got paid. They could demand a cut of the takings at the gate, which someone like the Circus Maximus is huge. And they become staggeringly rich. A Scorpus in our show is actually based on a real gladiator. There was a Scorpus.
Really?
Just after him, there was a guy called Gaius Diocles, who fortunately, he was a brilliant rider and he managed to survive 24 years racing chariots. Normally, you died a lot sooner than that. It was a very dangerous game. But 24 years, he earned 35 million sesterces. To put that in context, if we take a really famous sports person today who's then gone on to build an empire in another career, Michael Jordan, I think Forbes say he's worth about $3.75 billion. If Diocles were alive today, he'd be worth $15 billion.
Oh my God.
He would be the wealthiest sports star ever to have lived. The parallels are enormous, just as we worship our enormous sports stars, the very best in their professions, particularly those who take great risks like Formula One drivers, NASCAR drivers. They were the darlings of their day, and they were ordinary men made good. They didn't have an aristocratic background. They hadn't had life handed to them on a plate. They'd fought their way up, and they had become superstars. And that is the origin, I think, of our Western interest and obsession with big sport and superstar players.
Absolutely. Did studying ancient Rome and being sort of in this world make you think differently about our modern national pastimes?
Well, it makes you realise the sort of origins of them, really, that they come out of quite a brutal world.
Yeah.
Chariot racing was not of itself a blood sport, but because you raced 4 or 8 chariots around a track with very tight bends at each end, there were often crashes, which were called shipwrecks, and the whole audience would scream, "Shipwreck!" when they went over. A lot of people got killed doing that. It made me think at the time, well, you look back to sports car racing or Formula One racing in the 1950s and 60s, an awful lot of drivers then were killed. And it was considered, everyone knew it was a dangerous sport. And that was considered part of being a hero driver. We try to be a bit more safety conscious these days. But you could see the immediate parallel. You know, we often talk about competitions as being gladiatorial. You know, that great Super Bowl, it was gladiatorial, the two huge sides, these enormous guys facing off.
Yeah.
But that comes from, you know, competitions where literally people fought to the death. I often wonder if we watch, you know, impassioned sporting events, say boxing, which is still fighting, what would people do if it was available? Would people still watch that? I worry that perhaps some people might. So I think studying ancient sport makes you realise just how similar they are to modern sports, and wonder to what degree we have civilised those sports and how deep that veneer is.
I'm just curious, was there some aspect of Rome that you thought this show absolutely has to get right?
There are so many, really. And it's always just an impression when you make a dramatic series about the past. I think the main thing for me as a historian was twofold, was to show the sheer epic nature of the events we're mainly talking about and make that parallel with modern mega sporting events, sort of Olympic style events, to really show the wonder and show the parallels with the modern world. So we wanted to get the mechanics of how it works really right, because, you know, sports fans love to know about all the background and how it works and the technology and what goes on. And you've got to be convincing in that same way, because we're talking to an audience, I hope, who include those sports fans who are going to see this through a lens of their understanding of the sporting world. The other thing is to see that underclass in the wings, below the stage, behind closed doors, not just the marble palaces. It was really important to get the places like the betting taverns right, the behaviours in these places, the corruption. Like modern large-scale sport, it's worth a great deal of money, and to some degree that always brings with it corruption. Just like you have in modern sport, you find in chariot racing, they fix the chariots. People use doping. They dope the horses. They might even dope the driver.
What would they use to dope the horses or drivers?
The drugs available in the day. Again, Pliny's Natural History would help you find some of those. Any sort of alcohol, opioids, anything you could find, really, laudanum. So there are plenty of opportunities to nobble the opposition that way. You know, if you can't drug the driver, you could always try bribing him. Although if he's a very rich driver, you may have to bribe him a lot before he'll actually do anything for you.
Yeah.
And of course, going with all of that, the passion of the fans is just like today. You know, in England, we used to have quite a lot of trouble in football with hooliganism.
Yeah.
And that was the same in ancient Rome, these four factions. And when they didn't like what had happened, or they thought, you know, a race had been fixed, they would riot. These events go on for centuries. When the Roman Empire moves to Constantinople, to the Eastern Roman Empire, they still do chariot racing. A chariot race there in 532, where afterwards they didn't like the emperor. One of the factions particularly didn't like the emperor, who didn't favour their team. And they riot. And they threaten the Emperor Justinian, and they try and storm the palace, and he has to go and bribe all the leaders of the factions to get them off, and 30,000 people die in the riot.
Oh my God.
And this is a riot over a horse race. 30,000 dead.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we don't have that today. But the similarity of the passion of the group, when you support your team, you support them for life. You support them through thick and thin. Part of it is the hard times, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's exactly the same in Rome. And that feeling you have for your football team or your baseball team or your basketball team, that's the feeling that someone in the stands at the Circus Maximus has for the greens or the whites or the reds. It's fantastic.
The similarities between Roman sports and modern sports don't just end with the events themselves. After all, these games don't take place in a vacuum. A stadium full of screaming fans is a big part of the equation. You might even argue there are no sports without sports fans. I'd be inclined to agree with you. So why have humans been drawn to sporting events across thousands of years to watch epic struggles play out for their entertainment? When I talked to co-director and executive producer Marco Kreuspaintner, he spoke to that human need for competition and drew a fascinating parallel between Roman blood sport and the entertainment industry of today. One thing that I always find so interesting about historical period pieces, whether they're on film or movies or television shows, is the balance between historical accuracy and dramatic license to make an entertaining show. How did you approach that balance?
So Robert Rodat is somebody who is really super well read when it comes to ancient Rome.
Yeah.
Roland is very well read. I would say I'm pretty decent read when it comes to that, But obviously you put lots of effort into preparing yourself. The book itself that it's loosely based on by Daniel Mannix, Those About to Die, was a non-fiction book that described pretty well how the conditions in the underbelly, in the underworld of the Circus Maximus or the Colosseum, and how excessive the amount of effort that were going into providing entertainment to people who always wanted to have more and more and more. So to come back to what you asked before, yes, there's an artistic freedom because we don't know if a 10x in the way we are portraying him has existed, but it's highly likely. And it's especially in that time of the Flavian dynasty. This is the time when Vespasian and Titus built the Flavian amphitheater that we know nowadays at the Colosseum, a time where Rome was at its richest. It's very well documented, as we know, there's many books about it. But I think at the end of the day, as we were talking all the time, we're trying to do entertainment here.
It does feel like the show wears its influence from modern sports on its sleeve. Can you talk about dialing into that and portraying that on the show?
Now you could argue these days, what is entertainment? What are we doing actually to be a little bit self-critical about ourselves? Yes, we're trying also to tell empowerment stories, and therefore we try to raise consciousness about certain things, but we're also a little bit part of the people who are kind of, when they're not too happy with their lives, find a ventile through which they can get rid of their aggressions, their passions, what they're really yearning for. This was what happened in ancient Rome, right? A third of the year's time were fun and games, or games in this case.
It's so interesting. I didn't know about the factions for chariot racing. That felt so modern that these sports teams really have different colors and the fans are showing up wearing colors.
Exactly. No, and these are all historical facts. The 4 factions are obviously the ones who own these sports teams in ancient Rome, and they really have the power.
Tell me a little bit about the title, Those About to Die. What does that mean to you?
In general, as we know, this was what the gladiators were saying when they were coming into the arena. So there was a glory about it. Human life was not considered as something as we consider it today, as the highest precious good. In most of the countries of the world, life as its highest good is protected, And in Rome, this was obviously not the case. So dying for a bigger glory, as they try sometimes to teach us when it comes to war. I doubt that Generation Z is still buying very much into that.
Yeah.
But it was the claim. It was the claim to dedicate the gladiator's life to entertainment and to Rome.
What do you think it is about ancient Rome that captures audiences' imaginations?
God, let's not become Freudian here.
Yeah.
I think ancient Rome is the first known or well-known civilization to most of us. Yes, we know about the Egyptian ones, but we know only about palaces and pyramids and the slavery factor. We are not so much about everyday's life. The everyday's life is very well documented in Rome. And I think that we see ourselves in those ancient characters, and instinctively we feel that not a lot has changed, that people are still trying to take advantage of others, try to make it, try to survive, love their families, have difficulties feeding their families, wanting the best education for their kids, want to be entertained, want to love, are becoming victims of intrigues. And all of that is documented in Rome. It just very resonates with us. And Those About to Die is a show that condenses these elements in the most colorful and entertaining and fun way that I could imagine a show can be.
Things aren't that different now has been a recurring theme in the interviews we conducted for this podcast. For actors Dimitri Leonidas, who plays superstar charioteer Scorpus, and Gabriella Pession, who plays the wealthy patrician Antonia, that parallel between Roman sports and modern sports was particularly obvious. After all, Dimitri's character, Scorpus, is basically the LeBron James of 79 CE. A lot of the cast and crew have mentioned that they were surprised by how modern certain things in the show felt. Was that something you both experienced?
Sports is like an ancestral thing that humans have. We love to gather together to cheer for the best and to really kind of share this adrenaline and this love of sports, because it's a distraction really from life in a way. It's fun, but it's also a big distraction. In those moments, you feel completely bonded and close to what's happening in the stadium, and the world doesn't exist. At the end of the day, the human nature is what it is. We're just evolving to be less bad versions of what we are. We should have more respect for life than what they had. Again, is an ancestral instinct we have that I think it's similar.
Yeah, I think sports is sort of a live, almost improvised way of watching a heroic story again and again. There's an element of sports that we don't know what's going to happen, and it's unfolding in front of us. But there will be heroes and there will be losers, and all the virtues of courage and heroism are kind of built into that. The thing that did surprise me, and I don't really know why, because when I think about it, it's sort of obvious, but the ownership and the managerial layer between the athletes and the teams, for some reason, it just didn't occur to me that you would have shares in a team. When I was reading those scenes, and it felt so correct, but like something that just doesn't come up as a part of history. We hear about the patricians, we hear about the slaves, we hear about this sort of huge gap between these two classes. But actually, there were people that occupied these like managerial roles that today's equivalent would be like an agent almost, or like ownership over a club. It's like that there's sponsorship and there's endorsements. That for some reason surprised me, and I don't really know why. I guess it's just not an element that had ever been articulated for me when I think about ancient Rome. That was one thing that felt like a revelation, but probably shouldn't have.
Were there other things beyond sports that felt familiar?
When I went to see the Palatine with this friend of mine who's an expert on Roman history, I remember going around the Palatine and I saw this garden with all these pillars and columns, which is amazing. And so I asked her, say, well, what is this? And she said, the Romans just worked during the morning, because during the afternoon, they were cultivating the otium, which is pleasure. They were reading, they were thinking, they were writing. So they had time to cultivate, nourishing their mind. And I think it's such a modern, like we have now New Age and meditation and TM and Eckhart Tolle, all this that I love, by the way. I follow all this. They did it back then. They had actually a space. People were not working like crazy, like we are workaholic. We're just kind of a society that has to do more. It's never enough. We're on this continuous run into obtaining something that we'll never obtain because it's a mirage.
I like that. Of course, that kind of leisure was reserved for the patricians. I imagine the plebeian experience was very different.
You're totally right, because this place was in the Palatine, so where the patrician and the emperor used to live. The poor people were less than animals in Rome. They were treated like, the human life didn't really have the same value as it has today. But some of those kind of things that they had, if you can apply this wisdom of having some times just to think and to unwind, and apply it to all of us.
Given the similarities you both just mentioned, were there modern inspirations that helped you find your characters?
For me, the first thing was obviously what's in the script. And then in terms of trying to find a thread to modern day, it was discovering athletes that sort of worked as a template. So I went through a few that were from different fields as well, because there isn't a direct equivalent of chariot racing. You've got Formula One driving, but the personalities in Formula One driving, they're more sort of straight down the line guys. I mean, you had James Hunt back in the 70s, who was quite a wild guy, and he was kind of useful for a bit. And George Best, the footballer, Ronaldo, because of the status of how famous he is and how iconic he is. When you think of football, actually, you directly think of him sometimes. He's become almost the face of the sport. And in the end, you build a sort of collage of all of them. And at different times, some evoke a certain impulse that was useful in a scene. And at other times, another athlete, would do that. So they were useful, but each one could only take you so far. And it was also quite a fun exercise. It was actually one of the producers over a dinner that came up with George Best. It was the first one that really landed for me. And I was like, yes, that's great. That's a really good starting point.
Whether it's on a battlefield, a football field, or the sands of the Circus Maximus, uniforms tell the audience and the participants who's competing for who. And in the stands, fans dress themselves in the colors of their favorite athletes, showing support and sharing in the glory of a big win. For costume designer Gianni Calanuovo, making sure we saw an echo of modern sports culture was key to getting the visual look of those about to die just right. Do you like sports? And can you tell us sort of about how you dialed into that sports team mentality?
Anyone likes sports, right? I mean, how can you don't like sports? Maybe you don't like football, you like tennis, but we like sports. And this is the idea of this show. It's to show like how similar it's to our days, the chariot races, and how the people were crazy about the gladiators. It was more violent. There were deaths, but even today there are deaths, and sometimes, luckily, not like in the ancient Roman times. And the directors, they asked me to look at the sports today, the way, the fans, they dress, the colors, because we're using colors very much, the colors of the different teams.
The factions, yeah.
Of course, we couldn't do like contemporary stuff with the printed t-shirt and this kind of thing, but we found our way. And I don't want to say more. I just want the audience to look at it, and I'm sure they will recognize themselves, cheering for their favorites in the show. Sports was very important. It's very, very similar to what we are doing today, to the craziness that there is today. It's very, very similar.
Finally, it felt right to come back to director Roland Emmerich for the last word. In our conversation, we spoke about Roman emperors and the legacies they left behind. For Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, part of their legacy was the Flavian Amphitheater, aka the Colosseum, the single most enduring symbol of the power of sports in human history. But in my opinion, the legacy is more than just the physical structure, which, for the record, was actually built by Judean slaves. The true legacy of the Flavians is how they used the power of sports to both entertain and pacify the Roman populace. In other words, bread and circuses. Do you have a favorite Roman emperor?
I think Titus was a really good emperor, the son of Vespasian. And his legacy is to be a very, very good emperor who restores water for the thing and builds this enormously big bath.
And he would have finished the Flavian Amphitheater too, right?
Yes, he finished it and then started to have 100 days of inaugural games, which we don't show because he gets murdered on the first day. But everybody was so close to the action, so they saw everything really, really well. At the very beginning of the show, Domitian says, will be so exciting that the people can see everything. And then his father cuts in and says like, well, you guys own the Circus Maximus. We, the people of Rome, will own it. Which were naturally a trick, because it filled naturally the treasury really, really fast.
Yeah.
Actually, the Colosseum was only built because of the loot they brought home from Judea. And they brought 80,000 slaves back to Rome with them.
Oh, my God.
Think about it. 80,000. And these guys built the Colosseum. That was the only way they could do it. Because there was nobody in Rome who would said, I'm not like kind of schlepping stones around. I'm not like doing this, I'm not doing that. So they were very quite lazy and they wanted to be entertained and fed. That's what their main interest was.
Bread and circuses.
Exactly.
Thank you again to our guests, Justin Pollard, Marco Kreuspaintner, Dimitri Leonidas, Gabriella Pession, and of course, Roland Emmerich. And thanks to you, the listeners, for joining me on this journey through the making of Those About to Die. If you haven't yet, make sure to stream Those About to Die only on Peacock.